Hello and welcome to Memory Lesson 9, the final lesson in the memory topic. In this lesson we're going to look at how we can improve the accuracy of eyewitness testimony through the use of the cognitive interview. As usual, we'll have a look at a brief introduction to the topic, then we'll go through some key concepts, look at a couple of exam questions, and finish off with some evaluation points. The cognitive interview was developed by Fisher in 1984 in response to criticisms of the traditional police interview. The standard police interview revolves around the interviewer rather than the witness. The interviewer does most of the talking, often asking specific questions that require forced choice answers, such as, was the criminal black or white? The questions are often predetermined, following a written checklist, rather than them being fluid and being born out of a response given by the witness. Furthermore, witnesses are often discouraged from adding extra information, and also the interviewer may unconsciously ask leading questions to confirm his or her beliefs about the crime. Such practices often tend to increase the amount of inaccurate information collected in an interview, and so because of that, Fisher et al. Pioneered the development of several interviewing techniques that were all based on psychological principles. And collectively, those techniques became known as the cognitive interview. The techniques that are used in the cognitive interview are reinstate the context, report everything, change the perspective, and change the order. And we're now going to have a little look at what those techniques involve. The first one is reinstate the context. When using this technique, witnesses are encouraged to recreate the physical and psychological environment of the original incident. Witnesses might be asked to mentally place themselves back in the situation that they were in at the time of the event. They might be asked about the weather, about sights, sounds, smells, the way that they were feeling. Anything to do with the context of the situation, whether those are external things or internal things. And the aim is to make memories accessible through contextual and emotional cues. Report everything is more about a very, very detailed step-by-step account of what happened. So the interviewer encourages the reporting of every single detail of the event without editing anything. Witnesses should not leave anything out, even if they think it's completely insignificant. Change of perspective is fairly self-explanatory, so witnesses are asked to recall the event from multiple perspectives. So witnesses might, for example, be asked to describe the incident from the perspective of another witness, or from the perspective of the victim, or from the perspective of the suspect, for example. But just anything that isn't their own perspective. And then change the order, again, very self-explanatory. The interviewer might get the witness to run through the events in a different order, for example, from end to beginning, or maybe they'll even be asked to start in the middle and go to the end, or start in the middle and go to the beginning. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the techniques are all based on various theories from cognitive psychology. So we're just going to have a little look at that just to make sure that everybody kind of understands where these techniques have come from. So context reinstatement and recall everything is based on retrieval failure. You should all know what retrieval failure is. You will have gone over it already in the memory topic, but if you can't remember exactly, then I would recommend that you go back and just have a look at that so that you are confident with everything that I'm about to say. So both of these techniques are designed to encourage you to think about every single aspect of the event, no matter how small, in case anything that you remember acts as a cue for something that's more vital. So for example, you may remember a particular smell or a particular sound if you're reinstating the context, which could then act as a cue to a bigger memory and a more important memory. So the cognitive interview aims to provide cues in order to enhance your recall. The other concept is something called schema theory. Now, you'll learn all about schemas when you cover the cognitive approach, if you haven't done so already. So I'm not going to go into too much detail. I'm just going to give you the basics so that you kind of understand what the impact of it is for the cognitive interview. Now, essentially, over the course of our lives, people create cognitive frameworks for themselves that relate to the experiences that we've had. They can be related to objects, events, people, anything. and they help us to interpret a lot of information very, very quickly. They also help us to predict what is going to happen at any given point, and they help us to know how we should be behaving in any particular situation. So for example, if you go to a wedding, you're going to have a good idea of what's going to happen even if you've never been to one before, because you'll have picked up information about weddings from all over the place, whether that's books or film and TV or friends or magazines or whatever. So that means that you're going to have a very basic schema of a wedding, which will help you to predict what the day is going to be like and how you should behave. And that's really important for us because as people, we generally like to know what's going on. Nobody likes being in the dark. Now, the problem with schema is that they also act on your memory. If you ever have a point where you can't remember something or you just draw a blank, your schemas will fill in those blanks with expectations of what should have happened. So if you can't remember what happened after you witnessed a car crash, your schema of a car crash is going to fill in the little bits and pieces that you think might have been there because logically they should have been there, according to your schema. Now obviously that is going to be a problem for eyewitness testimony because people could start reporting their expectations rather than what they actually saw, which means that their reports aren't going to be accurate. Okay, so the cognitive interview, particularly the change of perspective and the reverse the order elements of the cognitive interview, are designed to stop people from reporting their expectations, but rather make them think about what actually happened by making them tell the story in reverse or from somebody else's perspective. So, moving on. It is possible that in an exam you might get asked to write a question for a cognitive interview. Now it's possible that it'll be very open-ended and they just say write any question that could be used in the cognitive interview, or they might ask you to write a question for a specific technique in the cognitive interview. So just so that you can see what it could look like, I've given you a question there for each of the techniques. Some of them are a little bit more detailed, like with the reinstate the context question, whereas others, like the change of perspective question, are quite simple and straightforward. I would recommend that you have a question ready just in case you get asked. It doesn't have to be exactly the same as mine. Write your own by all means, but the way that I've written it there is roughly what it should look like to be a good question for the cognitive interview. Okay, so coming towards the end of the outline now, Fisher et al. Also developed some additional elements of the cognitive interview where the focus was more on the social dynamics of the situation, and it was all about making the witness feel as calm and relaxed as possible. And this was called the enhanced cognitive interview. So this was all about things like knowing when to make eye contact and when not to make eye contact. Also about how to reduce anxiety in your witness, minimizing distractions, encouraging the witness to breathe slowly, asking open-ended questions, that kind of thing. Okay, so it's just another little add-on to the cognitive interview. Now, I'll add here at this point that if you are writing a 6-mark outline for the cognitive interview, unless you are specifically asked to do so, you don't have to talk about the enhanced cognitive interview. You can, it's not wrong to do so, but equally, if you talk about the 4 techniques, what they are and why they work, and give a little bit of an introduction to the cognitive interview, you will more than likely have plenty of detail to get the full 6 marks without talking about the enhanced cognitive interview. So just bear that in mind. You can write about it, but you don't have to, unless you are specifically told to do so. Right, so before we move on to our evaluation points, I've just got a couple of exam questions for you here. So question 1 is a 6-mark outline for the cognitive interview. If I was writing this one personally, I would be writing a little introduction to the cognitive interview, not too much though. Then I'd be naming and describing at least 2 or 3 techniques, and I would also be talking about why they work. At that point, I'd be having a look to see how much detail I've actually already got in, and then I'd make a decision as to whether or not to talk about the enhanced cognitive interview. If I've talked about all 4 techniques previously, I probably wouldn't, whereas if I only talked about 2, I might consider putting it in. Question 2, you don't have to worry about too much detail here because it's only 4 marks and they want you to talk about 2 techniques. So you'll get 2 marks for identifying the techniques and then another mark each for briefly explaining what that technique is. No detail is needed on why it works or anything like that, so don't overdo it, just keep it nice and simple for that one. Question 3 is an essay, so again your 3-mark outline, I would be writing it a little bit like I wrote question 2, whereas my evaluation section for 5 marks I'd be using 2 evaluation points, 1 strength and 1 limitation. And question 4 is just a multiple choice question that I threw in just to show you that multiple choice questions have come up for this topic as well. So let's have a quick look at some evaluation points then. I've got 4 for you, 2 strengths and 2 limitations. So the first strength is research support by Fisher et al. It's a really nice study to use. You'll definitely get some good marks for that. It's a fairly simple study. They compared the effectiveness of a standard police interview to a cognitive interview, and they found that the cognitive interview produced 46% more information and 90% more accurate information. Another research support for the cognitive interview was a meta-analysis by Kunken in 1999. They combined data from 55 studies comparing cognitive interview to the standard police interview. The cognitive interview gave 41% increase in accurate information compared to the standard interview. Okay, so there's another nice little bit of research support for you there. However, you've then got a direct contrast to the study beforehand, and here you can say that actually the quality might suffer. So for example, in Kunken's research, they also found an increase of inaccurate information recalled by participants as well, which was particularly an issue in the enhanced cognitive interview. Okay, so that means that police need to be very, very careful and treat all information collected from the cognitive interview with caution because it doesn't guarantee accuracy. And then as a final point, there is a little bit of an issue with the cognitive interview in practice, and that is that there is a great deal of time and training needed to implement it. So for example, you need more time to establish rapport with the witness and allow them to relax. You also require special training, and a lot of forces don't have the resources to provide more than a few hours. So those limitations mean that actually the use of the cognitive interview in police interviews hasn't been particularly widespread, and if it has been used, then very often it's used ineffectively or it hasn't been properly implemented. So that means that there are cases when the complete cognitive interview is not a realistic method for police officers to use, and it might actually make more sense to just focus on a couple of key elements within the cognitive interview and get those right and do those properly. Okay? So that is the end. There's been a fair bit of information there for the last lesson. I would suggest that you go back over these things a little bit again, particularly the evaluation points and also the information that I gave you on schema, just to make sure that you are completely happy with that. However, that being said, I hope it has all made sense and I hope it's been useful. If you have any questions or if you didn't understand anything, please feel free to pop them in the comment section below and I will do my best to get back to you ASAP. I hope it's been useful and thank you very much for listening.